Hello, welcome to Live Your Own Way with me, Lucy Gleeson Interiors, chatting homes, life and inspiration with my very special guests. Hello, welcome to Series 3. I hope all is well there with you. I'm back chatting with some super interesting folks and kicking off episode 1 with Zach Monro, founder of award-winning architects based in Brixton who cover homes, housing, workplaces, commercial properties and landscaping in the UK and beyond. You may also know him as host of Channel 4 show Inside Out Homes, working with clients on different budgets to achieve their dream homes with his state-of-the-art designs while cleverly merging the great outdoors. He was also an architect behind a project on Grand Designs and an esteemed judge on their House of the Year spin-off. So I'm really looking forward to discussing his work and inspiration behind some of these projects, what the future of architecture is currently looking like, and his thoughts on sustainability within his profession. Hello, Zach. Thanks so much for chatting with me. It's a real pleasure to talk to you about your inspiration and career so far and how you've created it all and built up such a successful architect's practice.
Well, it's a pleasure to be asked all these exciting questions. Thank you.
Well, my first thoughts are, having watched your work on the show Inside Out Homes, which we will talk about a little bit later, design appears to be intrinsic in you. It's like a natural understanding of people in their homes. So I'm intrigued about your early life and inspiration that led you to study architecture.
Yeah, I mean, I've not really thought about this, but interestingly enough, I think almost sort of a bit egotistically that I do definitely have this affinity with the space that surrounds people, man-made space, and almost things more than people. And I suspect, having young children who have recently been diagnosed with something similar, that I probably was always a little bit ADHD, autistic, that kind of stuff. Which led to that, because I've always really been drawn to those things, and I've always found that the home was a really, really key thing to me. Whenever we moved home, it was traumatic, more than it really needed to be, I think. And on the one hand, if you asked my mum about this, she'd say, yeah, he was always building stuff on holiday. We would go to a beach. I would just scour the beach for driftwood and make little huts and things, or climb trees and try and make dens in there, which I think is fairly usual behaviour for a young boy. And I know it to be now because my son does the same thing. But I also think that that for me, that the sort of the heart of the family was the home. And on the one, that's almost an unnatural position, because obviously it isn't. It's the family itself. It's the people. But I think from a very young age, I really associated those things together. And there was one thing that happened when I was about 5 or 6, which was that our house essentially got repossessed. And it was quite a shock, actually. And I must have been 5 or 6. And I haven't really thought about it for years and years and years. But recently I started to think, that might be part of it. This real kind of worry that this solid stuff that is in theory unmovable and permanent, actually it isn't. And I remember that. I mean, I remember there was a horrible occasion where I came back from school and I couldn't get into our house, and I couldn't work out why. And I, probably as a 5-year-old, broke into the house. I managed to get in through a window, and it was empty. And things that I thought were permanent, like a bedroom with all your stuff, was empty. There was gaps on the walls with paintings, and I sort of, I mean, I think that did actually have a profound effect on me, along with this kind of predisposition to give importance to space. So I don't know if that's a driver, but that definitely is one of my very early experiences of I suppose, architecture. This doesn't sound like a very good one.
No, it's really interesting. And I'd say as well, sort of having watched you, is that you're very nurturing of the people as well within the design process, your client.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one key, when we were studying architecture, a long time ago now, I remember one of the things that was very clear to me as a truth, and we would talk about it as students, was that to design well, you need to have an affinity with people. You need to have an empathy. You need to care and understand, who you're building for. So and I do. I suppose I sort of think I often say it to people who come work for us. If I mean, it sounds cutthroat now, but if we're hoping to make money on this, then go and work in a bank. No architect makes that much money apart from the top players. It's quite a difficult kind of environment to work in. And so I think people who end up in architecture are people who do care about the people and do believe fundamentally that design can make a huge difference to well-being.
And did anyone in particular inspire you along the way?
Um, yeah, there's been a few. Yes, yeah, absolutely. There's been a few sort of people. I mean, when I was quite young, I suspect. I mean, on the one hand, yes. On the other hand, no. So let's start with the no. I mean, I went to a fairly basic state school. I gather it was one of the lowest rated in London. There were no girls in it because it was a bit rough. And so my start of education was, I suppose you could say, rocky. But at that point, it was very clear to me that I didn't want to choose between arts and sciences. I wanted to do both. And when I told the careers advisor that I wanted to do that, they sent me to work in a printing factory because it's practical, but it's also to do with art, which it wasn't. Um, but then that did sort of spur me on to think, well, no, hang on, this isn't this is not what I meant. And so in a way, I sort of fallen. I want to say that I fell into architecture in a way, but I think other people could see it was what I wanted to do. I mean, it sounds crass to say my mum knew, but I had uncles who said, "Oh, yeah, you're probably going to be an architect." Watching me build stuff on the beach, and the obsession with Lego that every kid has, you know, and every parent takes to be a key that their kid is going to be a toweringly great architect was there. But in terms of inspiration, I think I did. I think I did find out quite early on that my grandfather wanted to be an architect. And growing up mainly without a father, my grandfather was a big father figure, and he was in the Second World War and therefore didn't become an architect. He came back and did something very different after that. So I think I must have sort of thought, well, he wants to do it. He's this amazing guy. Maybe I should do it. So not really an architect. And then I think my mum took me to see an early exhibition of Foster's, Rogers and Sterling at the Royal Academy. I must have been 15 or 14 or something. I already thought I might be an architect, so we went to look at it. And it's a very alien world to a young human. These really intricate technical models, um, and really strange drawings, but behind it this almost intangible passion for making people's worlds better and having a vision. This idea of you can have a vision for stuff, you can have a big plan, and you can work towards it. Was really inspiring, especially the work of Richard Rogers, who of the three to me always appeared to be the one who cared the most, which is probably rude for Sir Norman and James Sterling. Well, actually, I know James Sterling did care a lot as well, but Rogers is the one who hit home. And I think from that onwards, when I started to study architecture, I was kind of slightly feet in the mud with people like Le Corbusier, obviously, with modernists, and there was a whole postmodern thing at the time, which was kind of introducing elements of classical architecture in a playful manner, that kind of stuff. And I really wasn't. That just looked like plastic to me. There was this central thing that what you build should be expressed by what it's made of. There's an honesty to it. And so, the great modernists like Corbusier or even Laston here, or some of the kind of great English mid-century architects were the people I kind of looked to. I think they were kind of most inspiring. So yeah, they kind of helped me. But I also think you have to mention the people you work for. The most formative influences on you are probably the people you work for. And I worked for a bunch. So I worked for Jean Nouvel, at the time quite well-known architect in France, in Paris for a while. Came back. I worked for Michael Squires, who are quite a big firm that have a really good balance between commercial and kind of their artistic aspirations. But the biggest influence actually was a guy called Anthony Hudson, um, who was my sort of second real job after diploma. And it was a small practice, and there were three of us to start with. He was obviously the boss, and as a result, you very quickly were, oh my god, how do you build this? How big is a bit of wood? What are the standard? And then how do you understand this central train that your first idea goes through a set of iterations and it finishes as a really simple drawing that a builder's going to hold on a messy site and think, well, how do I build this? This is impossible to build. So there's a feedback loop where then you talk to the builder who says, well, actually, this is how we normally do it. I think working for Anthony Hudson, who I think are now called Hudson Architects, was one of the single biggest kind of leaps for me, because it's where I really learned a lot of the craft.
And so this all led you to start your own practice, didn't it? Which you've had for about 26 years now.
Yeah, I mean, 26 years? No, it can't be that long. Actually, I think I remember the first time I wasn't doing any work for Anthony at all was the year 2000. So it's
21,
21 years, yeah.
21 years.
Yeah, something like that. So I was doing little bits and pieces, to be honest, before then. And it did, yes. I mean, the format of his practice changed, and he kind of had a local director, and then he was moving back to Norfolk and stuff, and it was a different environment. And actually, I was thinking, if I'm going to work this hard and this late, I may as well be doing it for myself, you know. And so I had a bit of work coming, so I basically set up on myself in my in my front room, as the cliche goes.
This was in Brixton, wasn't it?
And this is in Brixton, yeah. So I'd been in Brixton for a while, and then for the last yeah, that's where the 26 comes from. That was how long I'd been in Brixton.
Ah, okay. And how many are in the team now?
So we're now eight, although there are some maternity absences at the moment. There's eight of us in the team. We're still in Brixton because I'm a very proud Brixtonian, and we're on our way to being a thing that is greater than the sum of its parts, I like to think.
And how many projects are you working on at any time?
So that's an interesting one, actually. I think we have about 20 or so, I think, going at any moment, of which half are very active. Half are very active, of which maybe there's two or three major projects at a time. So we manage our workflow quite carefully, but they range from things like little extensions where we can only really charge the client at cost because there's nothing in the budget for an architect. And it's a tiny, it's almost an opening in a window, and in the back of the house, and a tiny bit of an extension that makes a huge difference. To bigger stuff where you're looking at a master planning scheme for 400 houses down in the West Country, or we do actually one thing we're very proud of is we're working on this project in Brixton, which is the new Brixton House Theatre, and we're doing the building next to it along with Foster Wilson architects who are doing the theatre itself. And it's a building that I've known for the sort of 30 or so years I've been in Brixton, which was, people thought it was a squat. It was actually a sort of, with the council's permission, it was taken over by a housing cooperative that's called Carlton Mansions. And the council wanted to take possession of it again as part of a much bigger scheme, which was to bring a theatre and new homes to Lambeth, Brixton. And we managed to get in on the project, and we managed to secure that part of the work, partly because we're local architects and we're quite sensitive about these things, and we have kind of good connections, partly because our skill in working on existing houses is, I think, existing buildings is there, understood. And that's a really interesting project because it's commercial space, it's workspace, it's workshops, but it's on an existing building that has a lot of historic value, but it's also one that virtually should have been demolished and rebuilt. So it ranges, very, very much from kind of very beautiful, little posh, beautiful things to trying to change the world.
I think there's a general assumption with architecture that, the projects have to be really big, and that's why sometimes perhaps someone's put off from, looking for somebody for, like you say, a smaller space. But it's not the case, is it? You work on all different size projects.
I think for architects, it's quite hard to do the smaller projects. In over the years, I've developed a sort of, used tools to work out exactly how many hours we're going to spend on the project. And I think, as an architect, someone comes to you and says, "I want to do a re-extension. I've got £50,000." As an architect, I'm like, that is just not enough. No way. as a human, as a father of three in living in a house, I'm like, oh my god, that's so much money. And you sort of think, well, it's hard to then turn around to these people and say, um, well, if it's £50,000 or £150,000, we have to charge the same because the amount of work just to get the drawings down, have the conversations, and take it to planning is the same. Up until you get into sort of quarter of a million or half a million or a million, those early, tiny, small projects, they cost the same. So it's really hard to work to deal with that. And we really do make an effort to try and be able to take on those projects. We're very transparent about what it's going to cost. We work really hard to make it efficient. We sometimes, more than I'd like, make a loss on projects, and not even breaking even, but because you sort of care about what you're doing. And I think the truth is, in today's Britain, yes, an architect is a luxury for for building an extension. But the truth is also that it isn't a luxury at all. If you don't use an architect, the problems that you encounter, if you don't have a kind of clear understanding or someone in charge, someone takes responsibility, you end up with terrible problems. Problems like um, getting not to what you wanted and wasting the 50 grand that you had on an extension that you can't use and is too cold and it doesn't function, to Grenfell. You know, I think in our profession it's widely acknowledged one of the main drivers of Grenfell is the lack of what we like to call the golden thread. The person who did the drawings at the beginning understood what was being done, had no power at all while the thing was being built to say, this isn't right, that should change. No one was taking responsibility. It was the sort of cheapest possible build, run by, I suppose, market forces. And I suppose, you know, uh, 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 let's call them low rent tenants in market forces don't rate very highly. Clearly, from that system, not pointing any fingers, but in that system, tenants are less important than cheaper cladding. And so I think architects are essential, and I think in other European countries it's obvious. When I worked in France, there was no question that you would not use an architect for a project, but they can also really help on smaller projects. And I think that one of the things that we do as a practice is I support a shelter charity. Every year we choose a charity, and last year or so it's Beach Shelter. And I do free consults for people who have tiny projects that we can't take on. And I'll do a half hour, an hour consult. And we used, it's stuff that we used to have to charge quite a lot for. And before Zoom, we had to go and visit and take half a day. So it becomes quite expensive to do that. And you can't do 6 of those in a week before you go bust. But we do those for free, and and as long as they give a £50 donation to shelter, and that really, I mean, I think it's been really helpful because people are really grateful and happy to have that.
Oh, that's amazing.
And on the other hand, we've raised sort of about £2,500 this year alone from doing it. And so I think, well, you know, I think most architects believe it should be there for everyone. Good design and understanding construction should be available to everyone.
Yeah. It's a huge responsibility, isn't it, being an architect? It's not all kind of, just the finished product. There's so much that goes into it because obviously you're having to take into consideration, like, it's somebody's potential dream home and all the legalities and everything. So it isn't a job that you would just choose lightly.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, that's exactly right. It's not a job you would choose lightly. And when I was about just before I went to university, so probably 16 or 17, I went to do a bit of work experience. We found any architects that we knew, friends of the family and stuff, because no one in my family was, well, they weren't professionals, but no one was an architect. And I worked for architects, 3 different practices. I can't remember them all, but one was in Bury St Edmunds, they were called Medici. One was Greenwood Adams, who was the father of Matthew Lloyd architects. So Matthew Lloyd architects now. And I can't remember who the third was. But they all said, "Oh man, don't be an architect. Don't be an architect. It's just you don't earn enough. It's too much stress. You're massively liable." But they seemed all so happy, and they were such lovely people. I thought, well, yeah, I know what you're saying, but I'd love to be you. Why wouldn't I want Why would I want to do? Why would I want to do that? And I think that I do understand now, and I also often give the same advice. Maybe in the way you've couched it, don't tread lightly. Consider it because we are the least remunerated, uh, hardest working profession with the most liability. And you mentioned the liability of what you do to someone's home, which you can understand from my perspective is soul destroying if you get it wrong. But also the liability if you're the guy on site with the most insurance, and there's a team of lawyers behind the builders on a big project who are just looking to make those claims against you, which would almost put you out of business. So yes, it's when you do a drawing, it's not just draw something cool and yeah, that's amazing, right? Go and build that. It's like, well, if they build what you draw and there's something a bit wrong with what you draw, you will pay for it.
Yes, I can imagine it's stressful at times, but it must be so rewarding.
I think, yeah, I think it is stressful. I mean, we in the practice we're aware of the stress, and I think I'm probably most aware, and that the more senior you get in our practice, the more stress you're aware of, and I suppose in theory you can manage it better when you get older. And in a way, the youngest members of the team are the ones who are the least stressed, and that's great. So we sort of encourage it. We're not deliberately saying maybe you should be more stressed, but I think it is stressful, but it is extremely rewarding. But like many things in contemporary society, you often forget to celebrate the positives. And in our profession, you can imagine that a lot of our work is solving a problem, and once it's solved, moving on to the next problem again and again and again. If you solve a problem and then have a bottle of champagne and go, "Woo! Oh man, I worked out how this handrail works." If you did that all day long, you'd get nothing done.
Drink a lot of champagne.
Well, yeah, I mean, we don't drink that much champagne, but that's the image, isn't it? But I think the issue is that probably we forget sometimes. So I try and make a point now of at the end of a project, sitting down with a client and talking with them to learn how the first year in the house has been or in the project has been, to understand what they know from the building, and how they're enjoying it, and for me to get feedback, but also to just have a moment for them to say, um, uh, "Yeah, it's made a big difference," and I think they do. We recently finished a project um, down near the Surrey Hills, and they're such lovely clients, and it was quite an awkward build during COVID, but they are so lovely about it, and they say it's made such a difference to us. And the biggest thing that hit me on wasn't that. That's great, and I shared that with the team. And you're right; those elements are really rewarding. And we took the photographs; they're very rewarding. But one of the things they said to us was, it saved £100 a month off our heating bill. And this is a retrofit project, so it's renovating an existing house. And that's so rewarding because one of the biggest problems we face at the minute is climate change, and one of the issues we struggle with is building a new passive house. One thing, but actually, often the cheapest, the most efficient house sustainably is the one that already exists. So that they are suddenly the energy use of the house has gone down by that much. It really makes us sit back and think, okay, I know that my profession says I should be designing towers and airports and incredible houses on the side of cliffs. But if these smaller projects end up making a significant difference to the environment, then for me that's incredibly rewarding.
Yeah. Are you finding that clients are sort of more informed now on energy and sustainability, and have they already thought it through before they meet with you?
Not really. I mean, yes and no. So we a couple of years ago put in place a system where we make sure that we at least ask the question. That's the first point. You don't ask the question. There's always been, even within our practice a few years ago, there's this assumption, they won't be bothered. They don't want to spend the extra money. It's going to cost more. Let's not even ask. So now we always ask the question, um, and I push it a little bit, uh, and I think that, say, I don't know, 20 years ago, it was a niche. It appeared to be a niche market, though we, as architects, were all very concerned about. So, 20 years ago, I would never have been able to get an air source heat pump in a development or a mechanically vented heat recovery unit, what we call NVHR, into a house. Whereas 10 years ago, people were a little bit more. I think now people are totally aware of the climate emergency. It is an emergency, and if they really are like, yeah, whatever, then you think, well, you're not the clients for us, actually. I mean, I'm acutely aware that having worked for myself for 21 years, but been, worked for about pretty much 30 years now. Um, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And so in the early days, you get on and you just do the work. At the end of your life, if all you've done was you did the work and that's it, what is the sum total of what you did? And if the sum total of what you did is create a massive amount of carbon in the atmosphere and, really ruin your planet for your children and your grandchildren, then stop working. Then stop immediately. So I think we still encounter clients, and often they're the kind of mid-scale developers, you know, um, who are not convinced. I had a conversation recently. Someone said, heat pumps, they're not really efficient, are they?" And you're like, no, the reverse is true. If you're building a new house and you're not putting in a heat pump, then you're going to have a real problem in a few years' time when your gas boiler becomes illegal or when gas prices go up. From your money point of view, but you've straight away got a real problem, which is that you're relying on fossil fuels. So you are, your house is part of the problem. Your house is doing harm, as it were. So I think people have to be. I mean, I don't think they've got a choice. And if they come to us very quickly, they are aware because that's not all we talk about, but it's part of every conversation, very beginning to the very last one.
Yeah, big part. Are you finding that clients are happy to reuse and repurpose aspects of their homes more nowadays?
I don't know. I think different clients. So if we're talking about individual families in houses, I think that there's always this desire to keep stuff. Beyond what I would normally want to keep. You've lived in a house for a number of years, and though the drawing says you're going to remove the wall between the bedroom and the bathroom, when it goes, like, oh my god, the wall's gone. There's this natural reaction because you're almost physically connected to this house. It's your home. So I think people have naturally always wanted to, um, to keep stuff in their house because you're not caring about it. And so often, a lot of my job has been to convince them that that's not doing you any favors. You know, it's a sort of strange, like everything, a strange dichotomy between keeping stuff that you feel is significant, from an affective, as in affection point of view, and looking at the aspects of the house that are basically a prison. Sort of Victorian architecture, as pretty as it may be, is a difficult, leads to difficult behavior. If you have small windows low down in the wall, built traditionally, and spaces that cost a lot to heat, and therefore you're working with hot central heating, or you're cold at night and they're damp because they're single glazing, and you've packed in a load of houses, and the gardens are small and there's not a lot of lateral light. Well, that is something that affects you every morning, every afternoon, every evening of your life. So it has a massive effect. So sometimes the discussion is, well, we want to keep a lot of this, but I think a lot of what's wrong with the house is the fact that your window's too small. And classically for architects, bigger windows make a huge difference.
It's just really clear as well that you're very focused on merging the interiors and exteriors of building. Is that something you realised was important during training, or you've learnt along the way?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think both. I mean, architecture training is, or let's be kind about this, was haphazard, um, at best. So you don't, or we didn't learn that much about how to actually, realize an idea, in any of the schools that I went to. Um, but I think that there is a uh, a fundamental thing in our culture which comes from the modernist movement, what people friendly call mid-century modernism. But one of those cornerstones of modernism was the importance of context and connection to the context. Um, uh, you know, to be really blunt about it, if you got a massive window, then obviously you're much more connected to the outside, and it's much more connected to the inside. But on a less kind of potentially crass level, a building that is honest about itself will probably sit more comfortably, in its surroundings, be they urban or rural. I mean, a tree, for example, isn't about looking pretty on the outside, and the inside is completely different. A tree is purely a result of the function. This old adage of form follows function. Um, often been much maligned, but a tree sits there, and because it's obvious what it is as a thing, it doesn't need to justify its position in the landscape because it's quite comfortable. And I think good architecture does something similar, where it responds to its context, either by taking cues from it, um, or just like good psychological advice, just be yourself. if if the house is sitting there just being itself, then the way that shade from nearby plants falls across it as the sun moves through the sky, the way that different environments make it look different, the way that the materials weather, if it's straightforward, and if it is itself, then I think that really works. And for me, that's why my wife always says she's the kind of she has a hard life being the wife of a brutalist. I think people think brutalism is about brutal. It's nothing to do with the word brutal. Brutalism is about the French brut, brut champagne, for example. It's about honesty. And for me, that what that's saying is, if my house is built out of concrete, then I need to see that concrete. If my house is built out of wood, then I should see the wood. If I don't, you don't want to start building a building and the external finish is just it's just lipstick. It needs to perform a function.
What are your favourite kind of materials? If you had the opportunity to work with each time, what would you go for?
And we do use a lot of wood, and from an environmental point of view, that's something that we like. There's a thing at the moment which is essentially vacuum baked local timber, ash, for example. So vacuum baked ash. I think there's a company called Brimstone. I think a product called Brimstone, but there's some others. And what's nice about that is it's a timber that grows naturally in England, so it's local, but it has in its natural state it has very little use in construction. Once it's been vacuum baked, it's actually quite an interesting product. It ages differently and it can be used as external cladding. So we've used that quite a lot. I really like timber as a material. And and in complete opposition to my environmental credentials, I love concrete. It's just there's something about it that it's my guilty pleasure. Really, is how it is how you justify it. I know that you can't really. I do justify it in terms of buildings that will last more than 100 years old, that are well detailed, things that don't need to be redone. So I don't see us getting away from concrete massively. We try to, but and I also, I mean, the biggest thing for me is glass. I mean, unsurprisingly, when you get the things that glass does is it's just so magical, and that's always been there. I can remember as a kid going to exhibitions in the gallery from sort of contemporary artists where it was all about smoke and mirrors, essentially. It's the early days of video installations and that kind of stuff, and there'd be mirrors going on and glass, and you would go into a room. I seem to remember where the light levels were changing, so you wouldn't move. But at one point, you'd see the people the other side of the glass, and as the light levels changed, you didn't see your own reflection. And as the light levels changed again, you'd see some people further away in the room. This aspect that glass has of transmission of light and reflection almost for me defines how a human reacts to their environment. They take in some of the information, and and it does something to them, and they give it back in a way. Glass is just for me it's just magical. It really is. Yeah, I live in a house in Hudson now that we finished building very recently, and it's just basically everything faces one massive window onto the garden. Unsurprising. And it's a really simple move, but the reflections on the walls of the trees nearby as they change every day of every year, um, and as the clouds go past, and it means you can sit in one spot and learn to watch the world go by slowly.
On a practical level, talking of glass, how do you avoid drafts with glass if you've got great big windows?
You just design it properly. This is what one of the wonderful things of working with, in where we're working now. We now have very high tech glass, so even the best double glazing done properly works well. Triple glazing, even better. There's heated glass. I'm not a massive fan of it because putting energy into glass just to solve a problem seems a bit silly. It's not the glass that is the issue. It's the gaps around it. It's the framing. It's the aluminium framing or whatever you're using. If you design a house properly, it's much less of an issue. So, um, what we should be doing is putting big sections of glass on the south to catch the winter sun, and that's what happens here at my place. Is that from the morning on, from the early morning till about 1 o'clock, the sun goes deep into the house and heats the concrete floor, and so for the rest of the day, the house is warm naturally. So it doesn't use heating. The house, I think the heating only really ever goes on in November nowadays. So it goes on for 3 months a year.
Oh, that's amazing.
Maybe four, yeah. Especially for such a sort of big house, and it's because it gains so much from solar gain. So I think the issue isn't glass. The issue is an understanding of how you relate to your environment.
And so, talking of which, obviously, you had the show Inside Out Homes, and I'm waiting impatiently for more episodes of that. It's on Amazon Prime. So you work with loads of different clients on that, and it was quite diverse projects, really. Um, were you approached for that show, or how did that come about?
Yeah, I initially thought it was someone was pulling my leg. So I was the architect for a grand designs project a while back in Brixton called Park House, and that must have gone quite well because on the back of that, I think Channel 4 picked up this architect with some slightly interesting glasses. And the fact that I was clearly passionate about what I was doing, I think, I don't know, because they don't really tell you why they picked up. And then I started to be approached by production companies. And were all, I mean, I think what happened is someone at Channel 4 said, right, this is the guy we're going to have. Now, can you come up with a format for him? And what happened is a guy called John Silver, who's quite an important person in that world of kind of TV production and TV production, really interesting guy actually. He came up with this idea of trying to marry landscape architecture with architecture, and thought this was exactly what I'd been doing, what I've been trying to do for so long. And he came up with the format, and so as a result, we kind of talked about it more. But I mean, it was literally they said, "Oh, do you want to come in for a chat?" Channel 4 was like, "What? Why?" I had no idea why I was there. I had no idea what they wanted to talk about. I'm not really a TV person, or wasn't really a TV person much. So that happened, and you know what? It was the best thing. I am so grateful for that because you when you have to explain why you're doing what you're doing, you sort of remember why you're doing it. And I think when we sit there working away, especially times like these, COVID times that we've just sort of gone through, you forget what your kind of direction is. You're a bit rudderless. And I think that show really made me remember, oh yes, it's true. The modernisms talk about context. It's really about getting that stuff in. And it also, it sort of, it kind of sharpened up my kind of memory of what's wrong with this house for these people. Most of the time, it's because they are, yeah, they're imprisoned, and so they're not connected to nature, and we need to be connected. And I think that the common thread in all of those projects, which were all kind of live projects that we did, um, uh, was that the their lifestyle and their kind of their well-being was improved, and it demonstrated to be improved by a bit of design work.
Yeah, it was really clear to see, and I just really like the process of it because it's very hands on. And then, of course, you've got Monty Ravenscroft and Rosie Bynes from Petersham Nurseries. Um, The whole show was very involved. Was it a bit of a challenge working with a TV crew present?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, do you know what? They are lovely people. I'm not just saying that because they might be listening. They were generally lovely people. It's an interesting setup. I had a sort of brushed with fame previously, so I sort of knew about it. But I think I've always had a healthy disregard for some of this stuff. What I do have regard for is, technical expertise, and all of the people involved in a small crew like this are technically really proficient. The producers, the directors, the camera people, the sound guys, and I think having a really professional crew around you is really good, because suddenly you think, holy shit, I've got to be careful about this, because I don't want to, say the wrong line. I mean, that's loads of energy and presumably cost that all of these people. I'm sort of wasting their time, if you like. So I'm kind of honoured to be working with them. I trust them, and having gone through the grand designs process, which came out really nicely for us. I thought, well, my colleagues said that the grand designs that we did for Park House was one of the first ones where the architect was actually an architect and not just a sort of glorified, you know, um, sort of nerd on site who vaguely checked if the plaster was level or not. And the other thing about Inside Out Homes, I think, was working with Monty and Rosie was just fabulous. Like, I've known Monty for a long time, actually, before the show, and sort of socially, and it's so nice to see someone who has, I think, a very similar brain to me, but didn't go through the sort of same training as me, and so has a sort of freer way of thinking about design. If you come to with a problem, he knows it's possible. He comes to me with a similar problem. I'm like, well, I immediately think of the 20 reasons it's difficult and therefore expensive. He's like, no, there's a way of doing this, and he's always right. I think that's it's just so inspiring to work something like that. And we'd worked with landscape designers in the past that had just really planted stuff up and hadn't really listened and didn't really have an affinity to what the building was doing. I think working with Rosie Bynes was wonderful, because we talk about the project properly beforehand. She'd have a proper think about it, and sort of this double-edged sword of, on the one hand, as a gardener, she has time to think and consider, which is something that many of us lack, and sometimes in architecture we lack, which is really lovely to sit next to, because you're like, as I say, it sort of slows you down a bit, thinking, oh, okay, she's going to think for 10 minutes, fine. And then on the other hand, she does look at what you're doing, and they say, okay, well, if that's what the architecture is about, this is what we should do with the planting. So it was, it was stressful, because we were suddenly running. We usually stagger our projects. So at the minute, we've got like 20 projects, but they're staggered. So there's not 20 projects on site. That would be an absolute killer for us. The stress would be out just far too much. But this stuff all had to be delivered at a similar time. So we did have 12 projects, actually 13 projects, all running on site at the same time.
Wow.
And it's okay, but the buck stops with me in the practice. So I was running around being a bit presentery about the work I was doing, the work we were doing with the team, but also in the background arguing with contractors about delay contract, and arguing with planners about not giving us planning, and the usual stuff that makes you kind of worried. And all the while I had sort of Channel 4 breathing down my back saying, this thing needs to be delivered, next week. And I'm like, well, the plan, I can't force planners to do their job properly,
Yeah.
and in many cases they didn't. So it just made our life really tough. And I mean, that was my biggest regret. I think they ended up having to split the 7 episodes into 2 sections,
Right.
because, and that's possibly why they didn't recommission it, because it sort of lost our kind of prime time slot.
They need to recommission it. I need more episodes.
You know what? I would love, love, love to do it again, and I get nothing but good feedback on it. And I really liked the idea at the beginning when John Silver talked about it, that the guy saying, this sort of the Kevin McLeod figure saying, "Well, I'm not sure if they're going to finish," is the guy saying, "I'm not sure if I'm going to finish. It's all, it's my problem."
It's just a very relevant show. I think it changed perceptions for some people as well about how you can work with a flat pack home, how you can work with an architect on it. And also the flat that you did in Hackney, which you opened up and put in the glass
Yeah,
roof,
yeah.
was just absolutely stunning. I loved it.
Thank you, thank you. I mean, I'm still in contact with those clients. It's they're small projects that didn't help our pocket. massively, but I think they're really good lessons. And you can imagine if anyone else had a job where they were followed by a TV crew and they could go back and remember why they did a thing. It's such a learning experience.
Yeah.
And it's also, I quite like it because I've always thought I had a sixth sense when it comes to architecture, arrogantly. But on the other hand, I do listen a lot, and recently I sort of wondered, oh, do I really? Am I wrong here? When you've got some much more confident, maybe public school suited men in a room saying, no, 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 this is what you do. You sort of you listen. Well, and now what happens is I turn up and they've seen me on TV, so they actually listen. If you say I think you should do it this way, then we do it this way. And what's wonderful is it just means, okay, that means we can have a more interesting conversation about, well, how do you feel about this material? How do you feel about that material? Let's talk about the architecture rather than me drawing what you want.
I loved also the double height tiled wall in the Harrogate episode.
Oh yes.
Absolutely
Oh,
beautiful.
thank you. That was fun.
I found your thoughts on prefab housing really interesting as well, and the sort of the benefits of it. Do you see us using that form of housing more as time goes on again?
I do. I do think that the future of architecture is going to have a large element of prefabrication, or at least what they call modern methods of construction, because you know, from a sustainable point of view, we're not going to have a choice. And, we still have a housing crisis that we've had now for must be 10, 20 years. Um, and, you have to be able to build good quality stuff relatively inexpensively. And we have the technology now to do it. And I think that, people are scared of what they don't know. And I think when we were talking about flat pack housing 20 years ago, and 10 years ago, most people think, you know what? No, I'd rather just have it built out of brick. It's solid and it will last. Um, so there was a sort of stigma related to that and related to the post-war prefab, movement, where these houses that were supposed to last 20 years, some of them are still in place in areas of London.
Yeah, my grandparents' house is still standing in Leicester. It's a prefab house and it's still there. Yeah.
Is it? You see, and I think the people who live in them, like, they love them, they absolutely love them. But from the outside, I think it's not considered desirable. But I think as people, you know, get more and more bombarded by multiple images of different things and different cultures of design. They're a bit more open to it. And I think you're right that the project Anisha that we did for the show, which was essentially a prefab system, was was a demonstration that, well, they don't have to look the way you see them. These weird kind of white boxes, they can actually be done. You can do amazing things with them. And that's lovely on a private person's house. But where the kind of important work really is, okay, can you build a prototype and roll that out to 400 to 4,000 homes that bring these kind of life improving elements of build to housing, to everybody, to as many people as possible. If you can buy a wimpy home, but it's got little windows and minimum stairs and tiny corridors, and it's a bit dark in the middle, or you have to stay in a flat in the centre of town and it's got no energy and it's like a Victorian conversion, you'll probably stay in the Victorian conversion. But if you can move into a house that has skylights and big windows and a clever design around terracing or external space and a connection with its environments in this inside out thing, this context element, um, I think people are totally happy to do that, and to be able to demonstrate that in a small house was great. But we are working on a couple of schemes that might one day happen where we want to roll out a system build, and develop a house type that can be adapted so that you buy a 2-bed house and then you just buy the extension 5 years later when you've got kids and it's a 3-bed house kind of as a system. But it would be kit built, it would be fully sustainable, and it would be, in terms of operation, it would be uh, very low carbon. So you need almost no energy to um, to run the thing. I was lucky enough to be one of the judges at the Sterling Prize a couple of years ago, and at the year that it was awarded to a Goldsmith scheme. by Michael Riches, which is a passive house council estate essentially, and that though it may have not been the prettiest project in the Sterling Prize, I'm not saying it wasn't pretty, but it may not be the one that's some architects thought should be the winner because it's a piece of exquisite architecture. Um, it was revolutionary because met the tenants. The fact that their heating is less than 60, 70 quid a year, something like that, was less than £100 a year, is the single biggest change to their life. Which you sort of forget. The average wage in Britain is 20 something. It's not 50 something. And then when you chuck in rent and everything else, you can imagine what actually a low pay or unemployed living on unemployment must be like. So that you end up paying very, very low energy costs, and you get good daylighting and a bit of a balcony. I mean, that's the best way of kind of helping someone back into society, isn't it? But
Oh, absolutely.
that's where the future architecture for me is like, please, please, can we be building these kind of prototype houses based on the lessons we've learned, um, and making a significant difference to people.
Yeah, definitely. And your own home, obviously, you mentioned it a little while ago. What's it like?
How to describe it? It's basically a timber frame box on the upper level, sitting on top of a concrete uh, uh, basin, a concrete kind of tray. So there are retaining walls on all sides. There's a kind of big concrete box underneath where the bedrooms are, which give into various light wells, which are also have concrete. And then on top of that is a big sort of timber box which faces quite a nice garden.
Lovely.
And I think the thing about it that was helpful for me is because it was my project, I was able to try and enact some of our sustainable, these ideas that we know work, but we're never allowed to do because clients don't have the money or were unconvinced up until quite recently. So it's very airtight. It faces the right way. It's a single mass, so it's got the least amount of heat loss. The simplest shape is the better in terms of ecology, so that you don't have tons of surface area to lose heat through.
Yeah,
And it has a lot of glass on the south side,
beautiful.
facing a big tree. So that's one of the lovely things about it. So in the summer, when it could get really hot because it's got a big window facing the south, there's a massive tree in front of it shading it. So you have natural sort of shading. And then just as the winter starts to kick in, all the leaves drop off, and then you get direct light at a lower angle, therefore deeper into the building, heating more of it. So that's the kind of energy cycle on it. And most of the energy is also recycled because we have what's called an MVHR unit, which is essentially a ventilation system that covers the heat. So the air coming into the house from the outside is warmed by the air leaving the house.
Wow, that's
Uh,
clever.
And that means that, for example, when you're when you're heating a house and you kind of, and it's all very warm and you open the oven and you feel guilty about leaving the oven open for a bit because all this energy just going into the air. I don't feel guilty at all because I know that any energy produced by any machine in the house will stay in the house and heat the house. So the fridge running away, all night, and the ovens and washing machines and dishwashers, all and computers, all the energy that the heat is generated stays in the house. And I think that's kind of the cornerstone of this house is we did it. It wasn't perfect, so it's not as airtight as it should be, and there was a lot of mistakes made along the way. But as a core principle, it just gives me the confidence to say you have to do building like this because it makes a fundamental difference.
And is it your dream home?
Yeah, I mean, yes, the process was very painful for many reasons. We had some serious fallings out, and financially, it was kind of difficult. And I want to say, we almost didn't make it through as a sort of as a couple because it was, it really put pressure on us in a way it shouldn't have done. I mean, we took a chance actually, and maybe more of a chance than we should have done. Can't really say much more than that. Um, but uh, but now every time someone comes around and goes, "Oh my god, this is your house," you think, "Oh yeah, you're right. Oh my god, how lucky am I?" You really. So I think it is absolutely my dream home. But in the back of my mind, and I love it, and my children have got, it's transformed their lives. They had 2.5 rooms to live in as they became teenagers. It was a nightmare. There was stuff everywhere, and arguments about whose socks were whose socks and who hadn't cleaned up what are, just the usual.
Yep.
And now, now that they have a room that is theirs, and to be fair, an enormous amount of space to be in. Um, I've noticed that their behaviour has changed, and they, I started and will need to continue a sort of a video podcast on the house of Zach built, and I think I mentioned in it that I wanted my kids to be like posh kids, who were very confident and very eloquent about stuff in a way that I never was as a kid, outgoing and free to express themselves. And you know what? That's exactly what's happening. They are. I look at them and they come home from school with kind of political opinions and sense of justice and creative ideas, and you think, is that us or is it the house? And I think some of it is the house. It's the fact that they have a lot of space. I worked out that our main room in this house, which is the living, dining, kitchen, is the space of our entire house before.
Wow, goodness.
The whole house, two and a half bedrooms and a living room, kitchen. They all would fit into the main room we've got in this house.
It's amazing how quickly we get used to these things, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right. You're right. And so I feel a bit reticent to say it's my dream home because in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, well, I fixed that problem. What's the next one? You know,
That's
but
just obviously your nature
that's
for
just
your
your
work.
nature as an architect. That's what you do. But actually, when people come around and say that, you think, no, I'm really, really lucky.
Yeah,
Sometimes when
definitely.
the kids play up a bit, you say, if you have no idea how lucky you are, you know, just look around you. No one else has this. Get
Yeah.
on with it, which I think is the right attitude to have.
Well, I wish you much happiness there, and thank you ever so much for talking to me today. If you'd like to have a look at the Zach Monro Architects website, it is at www.z-m-a.co.uk, and you can see many of their homes, housing, community, commercial, and landscaping projects. They also have Instagram at Zach Monro Architects and Twitter at Monro Zach. And over on the website, you'll find their other platforms too. As I mentioned, you can catch Inside Out Homes on Amazon Prime currently, and I so recommend it, having watched the series twice myself. You can see what I'm up to over on my website, Lucy Gleason Interiors, www.lucylovesia.com, and find me on Instagram at Lucy Gleason Interiors. Next week, I've got another brilliant guest, so don't forget to subscribe to Live Your Own Way, and until then, have a good one.